Hi, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Riskologists. I'm your host, Andy Haslam, and today I'm joined by Sarah Williamson. So, Sarah, welcome to Riskologists.
Morning, Andy. Thank you.
So we always tend to start this off with the same question I ask everybody on it. So how's your podcast game? Have you done this before? Or do you listen to podcasts in general?
No, I'm a bit of a podcast new starter. I've done lots of presentations, panel discussions, things like that, but I think this is my first podcast.
Excellent. Well, glad to be the first one for you, so that's all good. As always, I like to kick things off with a bit of a journey to date. So how you started in your career, where it's taking you, and a bit of a timeline up to the very point of recording the podcast today. So fire away.
Well, it started quite a number of years ago, actually, my career, decades. I think I started work more than 30 years ago, which still surprises me because I feel really young. And you can see, Andy, that I look really young also.
Yeah. Of course.
So I'm a civil structural engineer, and that's at my heart. The role that I do now is very much a leadership role. But I actually started in construction, in building. My education and training, my career has been quite varied, and I think that's been really helpful to me. Following my first degree and graduation, I went and studied for a PhD, which is it was in civil structural engineering. But one of the big things that taught me was the art and practice of really thinking things through, thinking things from first principles, being a very independent thinker. After I'd finished my PhD, I spent some time in academia doing lecturing and research. And again, it's all building up my foundation skills that have got me to where I am now. So I'm thinking about things, I'm solving problems from first principles. I'm testing my understanding of the subjects that I've studied by trying to teach them to a bunch of very bright 18-year-olds. And at the time, I wasn't much older than them. So that was quite a good testing start. And then from my early 30s, I always joke and say I didn't have a proper job till I was 30 because I'd either worked for myself or been predominantly in studying or in academia. From my early 30s, I entered industry I always wanted to be a chartered structural engineer. I was fascinated by the process of becoming chartered and the exam that you have to do to get that qualification. And I've really spent my career in and around the construction industry, either in the research and academic side, the actual physical building side, or the design side. So I really like the whole process of delivering projects, physical projects, big stuff from concept to completion. And so ultimately, where I've ended up, I've gravitated to bigger civil projects, and I've spent nearly the last decade working on big infrastructure in the form of power stations, nuclear power stations, in fact. So that's where I am now.
That's great. No, it's a fascinating journey, and I think a lot of the guests that we've had, have had a similar thing in that they've had quite a varied career. And I always think, myself, I've had quite a varied career across a bunch of different industries and things along the way, and I think it only just helps. I don't think it's not a detriment at all. If anything, like you say, it helps build that base knowledge of everything and helps you really with everything else that comes after that.
Yeah, I think you're right. Having that breadth of experience, we often we're trying to do things differently, and having the more experience you've got to draw on, the more chance you've got, I think, of helping the industry to change direction.
No, 100%. I agree with you with that one. So kind of getting into the topic a little bit here, as everyone can already tell from the title of the episode, that we're going to be discussing risk management and how it's best kept at the forefront of every project professional's mind. Going into this in a little bit more detail shortly, but for the benefit of our listeners, please can you give a bit of a brief overview of your experience with risk management, when you first kind of came across it, your initial thoughts and how you currently utilize it?
So it's interesting. One of the reasons I was interested in talking to you on this podcast is because for me, having had the opportunity to think about risk and risk as a topic over what's becoming a relatively long career, it's an integral part of my work in life. It's part of the toolbox. It's part of the way I think, and it's actually an integral. We don't think about it. We don't necessarily stop and think, oh, I've just done a dynamic risk assessment, but it is actually an integral part of all of our everyday lives as well. So I think probably the first time I was introduced to risk in a very informal manner in my early years, where when I started my career, I was involved in construction, and the way that we managed risk then in the 80s was by thinking about what we were doing and essentially looking after our own health and safety. And that I like the idea. I really like categorizing risk. But first and foremost, the one that I think about in my profession is health and safety risk comes first. And then later on in my career, I started designing things. And as I was designing things, right, I'm designing a structure that's got to go from an idea on my piece of paper through the whole construction process to something that's in operation. And I'm sat there trying to think about, well, what could go wrong? How could this be built? What's my contribution as the designer to managing the risk associated with the delivery of this project? Whether that's the health and safety of the teams who are implementing the work, whether it is a technical risk, is there something about the materials or the methods that I'm choosing that might cause the project to go late or to cost more money? What am I going to do about this? And it was quite informal. We were left to really think about this ourselves. And then what would happen was the project goes to site, you get lots of queries back because we haven't had a structured way to think about and address the risk. So that's step one. Then I'm from West Cumbria, and I was brought up close to the Sellafield plant. I was going to say that plant's done that site's done many things over its career, from being the first nuclear power generation to reprocess into a big long history of decommissioning and cleanup. And I had the opportunity to work on some of the decommissioning projects in the high hazard areas, and I was introduced then to the discipline of hazard identification and the whole that level of really structured risk management, where we'd sit, because we were doing work in areas that were by the nature of hazardous. We had a very disciplined approach to sitting back and thinking with a full multidisciplinary team, what could go wrong, what would the mitigations be, what can we do, what can't we do. And it was that, I don't apply that level of formal discipline to my everyday life, but that's one of the experiences that I draw back on, and that I try to, anecdotally, the kind of thinking that I try to instill in the teams that I'm working with on whatever we're working on.
No, it's a great approach to have, and like you say, it almost becomes like a second nature type thing. That's what you want to try and get it to. So yeah, amazing that, Sarah. Thank you. So let's get into the topic a little bit. To those of us who are risk professionals, it always seems to be such an obvious thing that to have risk as an important and a constant consideration to these, in project space. But what's your experience been with that? Have you found it's a common thing for people to have it at the forefront, or is it really not the case?
I think it's so people will. I don't think you'd talk to any project professional who would say, oh no, we don't need to, risk is not at the heart of what we do in terms of how we manage our projects. It is absolutely at the heart of it. But getting a really practical and user-friendly implementation, that for me, that's the challenge. So if you're not careful, I think there's a risk that risk becomes an add-on, where the teams will go, oh God, I've done my work, I've planned my scope, I've done this, I've done that, and I need to look at the risks now. And rather than sit back and I like to really sit back and think about it and digest it. So in terms of getting risk into our work in practice, I think it is at the heart of every project professional's work in practice. But the impact of it, for me, the challenge is to make sure that the way we're managing our risk is really impactful. So if now I'm looking after a big program of work, and I've got lots of leaders who are responsible for the risk in their portion of the work, and the challenge for us is to be able to, without losing the meaning, be able to have the detailed consideration of risk in every single element of the scope, but be able to bring it up to a level where we can sit back and say, okay, in terms of the works that we're planning, what is it about our methods, our means, the external factors that could impact on our cost, on our schedule, on other parameters that we're addressing? And I think if you talk to people in the industry, there's a tendency for us to be trying to manage hundreds of risks. For me, to make it live, I expect the people who are sat around me to almost know off by heart the top 40 or top 50, and that's how we need to be testing we need to be testing those, not exactly daily, but on a regular heartbeat, because ultimately, so the challenge for me, my job is to deliver an artifact, an asset, to a safely, to the right quality, to a schedule and to a cost. So how do I do that? I identify that baseline, and then with the risk and opportunities associated with it, and then to bring it in as close as possible to that baseline, what do? I need to actively manage those risks. So it can't be seen as an add-on. It's got to be something that everybody in the organisation understands their part in, whether it's an upside or a downside. And I need to distribute those risks to the right part of the team as well. So I need people to be empowered to manage the risks that are in their control. So I need it cascaded up and down, and I need everybody to know their contribution and be really, really focusing on, what are the upside, what are the opportunities that I need to land, and what are the downside risks that I need to mitigate. Mm-hmm. So that's quite a long-winded answer, I think, but ultimately you need to spend enough time on the subject to make sure that everybody understands what are those key levers, and have I given them to the right people so that they can pull them, and am I checking on them every day to go, did you pull that one? Why didn't you pull it? Because I gave it to you and I should have given it to somebody else.
No, and I think following on from that, really, the next thing I was going to be asking was, have you found, is there a way that you found the best approach to take with your teams then when you're trying to instill this more conscious and continued approach to risk management, and also to kind of add to that, in the differences of the different areas that you've been working in, say Sellafield or, what you're currently working on now, have you had to take a different approach with that across the different teams?
I think in some areas, so if you're working in a high hazard area, it is a very much part of you do this and then you have to follow that step and then you follow that step. Where I am now, it's quite, I'm not going to say conversational, but it's something that we have to have as an ongoing dialogue. So we sit alongside there's a risk team, and we sit alongside the risk team, and we do all of the standard stuff where we score and the things, what are the trends, are they increasing or are they decreasing? But the thing that I like to do with the team is have the conversation. So, the bit I've just said about the levers. So I have the conversation, where are you with the risks that sit in your bit of the programme? How do they map up into the bigger programme risks or the portfolio risks, and are we managing everything properly so that it becomes a real integral part of our daily working life? It has to be seen, and it has to be a genuine tool, because I think it's really, really how we not exactly control, because we've got all of our performance metrics, but once you have a baseline, for me, having exemplary risk management is how we'll ultimately deliver the transformational performance that we're aiming for on not just the project I'm working on now, but on all projects. And what do we want to avoid? We always want to avoid the unplanned or the cost overruns and the schedule overruns that are typical certainly in the construction industry that I work in. And I'm absolutely convinced that one of the key ways in which we do that is being very, very serious about risk management. And I think this podcast is around risk professionals. Well, I could call myself a risk practitioner, because I'm not a risk professional. I'm a user of the support of the risk professional function. And I think whilst it's very easy to get sucked into the probabilistic analysis and the actual very technical side of it, we need to make sure that that's always balanced off against what is it that we're ultimately trying to achieve. And did we make sure that whatever it is that we put into our models, we really, really understand, and we've gone through the process, that parallel process that I've just described of dialoguing it with the teams and making sure that we really, really got to the heart of what it is that could go wrong or right even.
No, definitely. And on the same kind of note, really, about the engagement with the teams and making sure that it is at the forefront of what they're doing on a daily basis. Have you had any kind of areas where you've actually really found more resistance to it from any of your teams and so on?
I don't think it's resistance. I think there's more of, I think there's a couple of things that stand out for me. One is, if you've got teams that are under pressure and they've got to get something out, then there are certain things that are the things that get that start to get less serious attention. So that's one thing. And I think there's another thing. the process that I've just described to you, the way that I like to approach risk, you need space. In fact, that's, just said, when if people are under pressure, then it can become a more tick box exercise. The approach that I like to take requires space, it requires time, it requires chewing things over, changing your mind a bit. And I think when you're either under time pressure or you're overly process constrained, it can impact the quality of the thought that goes into the risk process. So I've had experiences where we're working in fairly constrained environments. I'll give you a design example. I've talked about what could go wrong, what could the impact of our methods or means be on cost or schedule or risk to life and limb and all of that. And working on a project where the design was subject to multiple layers of review. So there's a perception in people's minds that the way that we're managing the risk is by having somebody looking over your shoulder and somebody looking over your shoulder, and losing the accountability. At which level in the organisation is that accountability for having thought through from first principles what could go wrong, what are we doing about it, what's unusual here, just having that brainstorm around what might happen. And so being in that environment, it's not exactly groupthink, but that over constrained environment, I've had experiences where things have gone wrong, and when we dig into it and ask the basic questions about, okay, so go back to first principles. I don't need to write a procedure, just go back to first principles. What was unusual about the thing? What could have gone wrong? What's not part of our normal practice? We go, oh yeah, well, we don't normally do that. And oh no, well, we don't normally make a connection like that. And no, we don't normally cite that there. So it's that, I think that's one of, I take very seriously my responsibility as a leader, and it's a message for other leaders in the industry. You've got to create that space for your teams and make sure that it's not just following a process. Are you actually fundamentally thinking this thing through from first principles? And nobody, if you're able to create that environment, then there is no resistance, because who doesn't not want to deliver a job that manages the risk, identifies and then actively manages the risk.
It's a really great point, and again, the term that keeps coming up a lot in all of our episodes. I don't think there's one where it hasn't come up, is the whole tick box exercise. And I think that, like you say, actually giving people that space to really focus on what they're doing with it, and not have someone peering over their shoulder, not feeling like they're having to do it just for ticking a box, is a massive thing, and will, as you say, get rid of that resistance to it, because they actually feel like they're actually getting something out of it and doing something with it. So kind of, again, moving on really from that, one of the things we discussed in the lead up to today was how, we really learn best from doing, and more often than not really from failing. However, we don't really want to experience any failures within projects, especially high hazard environments like you've already mentioned. We rely a lot on lessons learned from and the passing on of knowledge to try and educate others, to make sure that those mistakes that we've had or we've made in the past, and to try and foresee those that may come in the future. But how do we do this effectively? And have you had any experiences where past issues have helped you to pass on lessons learned to your teams and aid them in thinking about identifying similar issues in the future?
It's a really interesting one, because lessons learned along with risk is another topic. It's something that is so easy to say, so hard to do. Really hard to do in a way that's meaningful. And I've spent a lot of time with my teams thinking about this and trying to really categorize learning into, we have industry learning. So the National Audit Office, etc., publish great documentation that we all, again, it's a space and time thing. We're all time poor these days. It's about carving out time to understand what's going on in your industry. So this is the way I approach it with a team, and make sure that you understand what's industry specific. And then from a project perspective, we always talk about plan, do, review. What does that mean? What does that really mean? So you've got your forward thinking. You've got to have the space and time to think through what it is you're planning to do and what could go wrong and how you're going to mitigate it. And then as you're doing the thing, it's another big discipline to really say, okay, we've planned something, we've got so far. how is it going?
Yeah.
How is it going? What if it's an actual physical piece of work? What's the feedback from the team? Where do we need to change direction? So you've almost got your industry learning. I say project learning because then there is something before you start any project. You need to understand, well, what's happened in the past. What are the general do's and don'ts on a project of this type? And then the next bit, I always call it the living learning.
Mm-hmm.
I think if you write it down, there are points in time at which you go, right, I'm going to stop now. I'm going to write all that down because I think that's a really useful repository for other people to come and pick up. Mm-hmm. But then during the role and during the implementation phase, you have to be very careful to create that living learning environment where part of your processes are, we stop, we assess what we've done to date, we assess is it going to plan, we take the feedback from those who are actually implementing our plans, and if necessary, we change direction. Mm-hmm. So the two really go hand in hand, because that learning is part of your active risk management, really.
No, definitely. So you taking on those things, do you take them at particular milestones throughout the project then, or are you just making it like a regular drumbeat with your teams to be doing those points of assessing where you are at the time and potentially changing or rebaselining maybe from there?
So think of it like a Russian doll, because you start with the project in a planning phase, then everything is about what are we going to do, what are we going to do. When you're actually in implementation, then there are cycles. There's a daily cycle. Each day, people actually start work. At the end of the day, we should be able to sit back and go, okay, how did our day go today? What should we do differently? So every time for me, every time I see a new method implemented, or the same methods implemented in a different area, then we should be sitting back and feeding back how did that go? What do we need to do differently? So there's a daily cycle, a weekly cycle, as you finish a piece of work cycle, as you finish a project cycle. So it's almost you could look at it as almost a learning calendar that went through the whole project life cycle.
Excellent. No, it's a really interesting thing, which I think a lot of professionals could probably take away from that as like you say, the rolling continuous, not just monitoring your own risks and then monitoring the project as it is how it's coming across and how it's developing, but adding those lessons learned along the way, as opposed to, like you say, get towards the end of it, then look back and then try and take from there.
Exactly. And the other point for me is, people talk a lot about what lessons we've learned, but unless depending where you are in a team, you might not know what the lessons learned were, but what you will be doing is working to the new improved ways of working. So it's not a lesson until it's been capitalized. Yeah. So somebody's had a great new idea, or somebody's observed a better way of doing something, then it's only when we've actually implemented it into the method or into our ways of working that it is a lesson. And I think that's a really interesting dilemma for us as well, because sometimes you put into a position where somebody will say, so what are the lessons, and what, but my working team just need to know that they don't have to have encyclopedic knowledge of, there was this lesson, there was that lesson. They just need to know that we're in an environment of continuous improvement and risk management, whereby managing the risks is allowing us to deliver our targets, and the learning is allowing us to, it's another form of risk management, really, that we don't learn and then we don't continuously improve. So all of these things, if you're not careful, because they are big subjects and they are almost become professions on their own, if you're not careful, they don't become integrated into your project life. So you're not like your project isn't a system of systems. It becomes we do lessons, we do safety, we do quality, we do risk. No, we deliver a project, and all of these things are integral into the way we deliver our project.
No, I agree with you wholeheartedly on everything with that. Moving on slightly, so without really wanting to kind of lead the witness, really, have you found having dedicated risk professionals in regular contact and working alongside your team helps to keep risk at the forefront of their minds then?
Oh, absolutely. And I love it because I like the technical aspect of risk management as well. So I like the probabilistic side of things. So having the risk professionals in the team, and that tension between, practically we think this could go wrong and it's going to be somewhere between there or there, and that's more likely than that, and that's more likely than that. Having the risk professionals to interpret that into their language and model it for us, so that we work together and we end up with with the outputs that are a tool to inform our thinking. Really, I think it's absolutely invaluable. For me, I find it is personally fascinating and it's professionally invaluable.
Excellent. Very good to hear. We always like to hear that the risk professionals are well needed. So yeah.
Oh no, big shout out to my risk team.
Awesome, excellent. Kind of moving on again, really onto like the next question. Really, if you could put a bit of a list of must-haves, nice-to-haves, and not necessaries, from all the risk practices that you tend to have, or the general risk management that we all know, for your daily workload, what would they be? Your must-haves, nice-to-haves, and not necessaries.
Everybody needs to know the top 10.
Mm-hmm.
So I'll put it a slightly different way. When I spent a lot of time doing structural analysis using fancy computer software, because I thought it was really cool to understand how to run the fancy computer software, and you can see risk in that same way. Mm-hmm. And the discipline that I had, and I could be challenged on this, but this is what I still live by. The discipline I had was any analysis that I was going to do, I could do on a piece of paper some really simple calculations, and I knew broadly that I could then do a check on what came out of the computer. So I expect the must-have is that in parallel to the work that's being done by the risk professional, we need to be absolutely rigorous in ensuring that the inputs that we give are completely robust. So that goes back to what I was talking about earlier about the dialogue in the risks and testing them and what's more important and what's more likely and what's less likely. So for me, that is an absolute must-have. What's not necessary is a risk register with 500 or 1,000 risks on it. That's a must not have, actually.
Yeah.
Definitely. And what we mustn't have is that for me, less is more. We mustn't have a culture where the team think, oh, if I've got a massive load of risks, then I've done a really great job.
No, again, it's another thing that I wholeheartedly agree with. And, I think you've got to have a risk register, but you've got to have a good risk register. And like you say, if you've got the iterative process, like you've already mentioned about going through and constantly looking at those lessons learned, if you're constantly updating your risk register, then you shouldn't have 500 risks on there. You should have, like you say, everything that's kind of pertinent to the time. And it doesn't mean that it can't evolve and things can't be added and things can't be closed off. So yeah, I agree with you on everything with that. So adding on from those, do you think that there are any deliverables or things that you're currently missing from your general risk management services, things that you would really benefit you and your teams? Have you had any experiences with things like reference class forecasting, for example? And do you think there's things that something that would help you in any of your current environments better?
So reference, I mean, I'm quite lucky actually, because I think we've got quite a broad range of approaches to risks available to us. The project I'm working on now there's a layered approach, and there is reference class forecasting is considered at one level because of who we're engaging with. And I find reference class forecasting really interesting, especially in the industry I'm in and the job that I'm trying to do now. And a little bit of my academic background as well. I was an experimentalist in structures in the 90s, and extrapolation was terrifying to me. Mm-hmm. And so I find reference class forecasting also. One of my raisons d'etre, which I didn't really say in the introduction, is about transforming the construction industry. It's an industry that has not really progressed in the last decades. So whilst I think, you've heard me wax lyrical about lessons learned, absolutely we learn the lessons of the past, but I'm really interested in figuring out, well, how do we turn the dial? How do we change the trajectory? So I think it's great to have all of those tools available, but it's got to be in the context of, you take it in the context of what you're trying to achieve. And also from a level of being prudent, I suppose, I'm a practitioner. My objective to deliver transformation in my industry, to deliver what my customers need, whether I consider my customers as my shareholders, the taxpayers. From another perspective, there's a prudent investor somewhere that is not interested in the fact that I want to change the trajectory and do things better. They want to know that, are we going to earn a return on our investment regardless? So it's having the right tool for the right reason, I suppose.
Well, awesome. Thanks for that, Sarah. So as we're kind of starting to wrap things up a little bit, if you were to give some advice to other project teams out there listening regarding how they should embrace best risk practices and, get the engagement from their teams and keep it at the forefront of their minds, what would you say to them?
Well, I think the message is from the whole story or our whole conversation for me about it's understand your context, understand what's appropriate in terms of risk management, lessons learned for your environment, and build it in and believe it. Do it in a way that's believable and credible to you. And if it's believable and credible to you, then it will be to your teams.
Yeah, and I think the one thing that I've kind of really taken from the conversation so far, which I think seems very much an obvious thing to go with, but is so limited in terms of what is done, and especially some of the clients that I've dealt with in the past, is actually giving people the time and the space to look at it and do it properly. It's such an obvious thing to say, take your time, look at it, but as you say, we're all time poor at the moment, I think, in a lot of things, and there's always the push for it. So to kind of add to what you've already mentioned, and it just take from what's already been discussed so far in the conversation, that's one thing that I will really take away from this, and I would pass on to any of the other clients that I deal with in the future as well. So yeah, that's a really big takeaway, I think, for me, and I'm sure for anybody else who's listening as well. So really, again, that we're on the subject of advice and everything, Sarah, we always all our regular listeners will know that we always end the podcast really with a question, and that question is, if you were to give yourself one piece of advice at the start of your career that you maybe picked up along the way, what would that be?
So it's a funny one, this. So if you probably, I don't know whether you show any pictures or videos with this, Andy, but if the listeners don't know, I'm actually a woman as well as everything else that I've just described. And I think I'm fairly curious. I've always questioned myself, and I think throughout my career I've probably over questioned, and I think that and gender doesn't help that. So I think without being arrogant, I think self-belief is really important.
No, again, great advice. And, I don't think there's anyone really who's doubled up on any advice so far in any of our guests. So a very simple thing, but it definitely something to take away from it. So really that kind of brings us to the end of the podcast, and it just leaves it for me to thank you very much, Sarah, for your time in the build up to today, and obviously for today itself. If anybody who's been listening to the podcast has any questions or anything about this, obviously they can contact us and contact me through here, and I'll probably liaise something back to yourself. And, if we can do, we'll help out with anything there. But again, it's been, a really good podcast, really enjoyed it, and some really great examples and great experience, and, some great lessons, I think, for everybody to take away from it. So thanks again, Sarah. It's been a blast.
Thank you.
Excellent. And anybody else listening, obviously stay tuned for the next episode coming soon.